That's the one. So, welcome back. This evening, last time we met, we kind of dove back into the Zohar and did a little bit of an intro. I'm going to mostly skip over that because I think everyone's heard that before. And instead want to take a look at two texts, if we have time, from different places in the Zohar. One of which, if you've ever done any of these classes with me before, we've probably looked at. So apologies if you've seen it before. And the other of which kind of goes with it, and we definitely haven't looked at before. And the reason it might be familiar is because it's quite a famous one, and it's linked, of course, to this coming week's parasha with Bishalach. Bishalach is the Shabbat of song, of course, Renata. And it's also the Shabbat which describes the splitting of the sea. And there's a lot of that the Zohar has to say about that moment and how it envisions that moment and what that looks like. Most of us, of course, have in our minds a certain, as I affectionately call, children's illustrated Bible version of that moment, the sea splitting and the people in their robes and sandals walking through the middle. The Zohar has a kind of different image of what's happening, radically different in some ways, which I think challenges our perception of what's going on in those key chapters in Exodus. So that's what we want to take a look at. And then hopefully it'll expose us to a new idea, or a newish idea, or just a different idea about the divine feminine, which is the main topic in some way of the text, which is goes by many names in the Zohar narratives. We've seen the word Shekhinah before. Here we're going to see the word Matronita, which is a Latin word for little mother, itself a kind of paradoxical term. We're going to see lots of other names for her, capital H, her, or capital S, she. And indeed, it's very challenging, as we've talked about before, to our concept that Judaism is a purely monotheistic religion, when the Zohar spends an awful lot of time talking about he and she, him and her, these two entities who have a sexual and rather conflicted relationship between the two of them. So part of what we're going to get a look at is the explanation of what happens in Bishalach. Part of it is an introduction to the personality of the Matronita, as she's mostly referred to here. And hopefully everyone can see that. Is that clear? Big enough? Cool. So we're going to start where the green is. I've learned the benefit, actually, of having the highlight feature at my disposal. And we are going to, as usual, just kind of read our way through it. And again, apologies, you will have seen this before if you've done this class with me before. And make it a bit bigger. And now we've lost this spot. There it is. So we can see two columns at once, if that makes sense. And that way we can dive in. Actually, I think it looked better with the way. I'm going to tinker a little bit here. Hang on. Is that all right? Everyone see that? Okay. So who wants to read first for us from Rabbi Abba said? Any volunteers? Oh, Lorraine, I see a hand. Thank you. Take yourself off mute if you're on it.
I'm off mute now.
There we go. Thank you.
Rabbi Abba said, "How many thousands, how many myriads of holy camps does the Blessed Holy One have? Masters of supernal faces, masters of eyes, masters of weapons, masters of trumpeting, masters of howling, masters of judgment, masters of compassion. Above them, he has appointed Matronita, minister before him in the palace."
Okay, let's just pause there. We have this useful exposition which summarizes the main idea that they're going to explore, which is what? What's all this dramatic language about?
So I think the camps isn't directly camps necessarily or angels. It's the faces. It's how many different ways we can look at God and how he looks upon us. He's this one, he's that one, he's everyone. And above them all, we've got the Matronita, which I think is talking about. So we're looking at the idea of Elohim, the fact that there's many gods, but they're all one God. So it's one God who is in charge of all these different facets. So the Matronita is the God as we know her, But God has these different faces, the God of compassion, the God of judgment, the God of this and the God of that, who are all part of the same person, just different aspects.
Okay, love that, right? Very good connection as well to the common rabbinic idea. There's 70 faces to the Torah and 70 nations and all these ideas that God is multifaceted. But there is a more mundane sense that we're talking about military camps as well. I think it might be both and. Robin, what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, the image that I had was of an army, a military, a military gathering.
Yeah,
and above it all was the Matronita.
Yeah. So, David, I don't think you're wrong. I think they're definitely playing with that sense of God being multifaceted, but they're also, in a very kind of straightforward way, ironically, laying out this idea that there are all these armies in heaven, let's say, heaven being a very loaded term. And they use the word camps here. It's a translation of the same word in Hebrew. It's sivaot, a word we use a lot, and we don't really know how to translate it. Hosts, camps. Of course, in any contemporary Hebrew, that would imply armies, sivaot. And there's a similar connotation to this as well, that there are all these different legions of heavenly soldiers. We can call them angels, we can call them beings. We don't necessarily, it doesn't really matter. They all have different attributes, right? Ones that carry weapons, ones that howl, ones that have judgment, ones that have compassion, reflecting indeed God's kind of many different faces. But critically, above all of these angelic hosts and camps and armies, there's one warlordess, war lady, not a word we use often, maybe we will need to tonight, who is in fact in charge of all of them. The commander of the heavenly armies is Matronita.
And that's what I find interesting here, the fact that it says above them he has appointed Matronita.
Very good.
We see Matronita as God. So who has appointed it? God's appointed himself, or God's appointed this female to be? Yeah.
Like, where does this split come from? What does it look like from our point of view, right? If she's above all of the heavenly angels, then is that all we see? That's very much exactly the question that we should be asking, is kind of, what does this mean? He appointed her. Who is he? Who is her? What is the relationship between them? And what does it matter to us? Who do we encounter when we encounter such a being in whatever guise? Hello, David, who's just joined us. So let's carry on, if that's okay. And Lorraine, you were doing a great job reading. Do you want to continue a bit more?
Yeah. Corresponding to these, Matronita has armed camps, bearing 60 faces, all girded with swords, encircling her. Before her they go forth, before her they come in. With 6 wings they fly through the world. In front of every single one, coals of flaming fire, his garments flashing fire. On his back, blade of a sword flashing throughout the world to guard her. As it is written, the flame of the whirling sword to guard the way of the tree of life. Genesis 3:24.
Thank you. Right. Again, another really lovely, emotive, imagistic paragraph. What comes to mind when we read this? What are you seeing? Would you say, Robin? Sorry, I thought I heard someone.
I didn't say.
Oh.
But I sort of get images of something like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. But,
yeah. Right. This is some cross between kind of Joan of Arc and Tolkien here, right?
Yeah.
We've got this female figure who we still don't know a great deal about. What exactly that means. We say Matronita. Remember, a matron is a noble lady, right? She is a lady in the sense of chivalric medieval culture, lady, capital L, the way that you're still a lady, and you can have that tick box in any British form if you have the right accolades to go with it. Matronita, though, is the diminutive prefix, so she's kind of our little lady, right? Just to point out, there's something that resonates a lot with Christian culture of the time that talks about Mother Mary in similar language, right? Our noble lady, our sacred lady, the virgin lady, all this language, very similar. So we're talking about Matronita. She has herself armies that surround her. Each of those armies has 60 faces. Hard to imagine what that means. They have weapons. They're around her, circling her. They have 6 wings. Again, a reference to the depictions of angels in the book of Isaiah in particular. And they fly throughout the world. They've got coals of flaming fire, and their garments are made of fire, and on their back is a sword, which presumably is also made of fire, although it doesn't say. But it does give us a wonderfully unusual interpretation of a strange verse in the Torah at the end of chapter 3 of Genesis, which describes Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden, and then says that there was a flame of a whirling sword, or a sword that is spinning, which guards the way to the tree of life. It's a hard verse to parse in the first place. Here, they've given us a wonderfully easy way to understand it. What does that verse mean? Oh, the flame of the whirling sword are all of the angels that guard the way, that is the way to approach the tree of life. And who is the tree of life? Tree of life?
Matronita.
Matronita, as is going to tell us very shortly, right? Just to point out, as we dive into the next paragraph, we sing very often in synagogue a verse, Eitz Chaim Hi Lamachazikim Ba, right? She is a tree of life, literally, to those who cling to her. Now, what we usually mean by that, the he in that references the Torah, typically. Although, here in the Zohar, they're reading that same verse, Eitz Chaim Hi Lamachazikim Ba, she is a tree of life to those who cling to her, as being very much about Matronita, as we're going to see. David, were you volunteering to read next? I saw a advance of a hand.
I don't think you did.
Oh, would you like to?
I'll struggle because it's on a small phone, but I'll give it a go.
Okay.
Who is the way to the tree of life? Matronita. Who is the way to that great and mighty tree, the tree of life? And it is written, behold the bed of Solomon, 60 warriors surrounding her, of the warriors of Israel. And that comes from Song of Songs. Israel above all of them, skilled with a sword, also from Song of Songs. When Matronita moves, they all move behind her. As it is written, the angel of Elohim moved. That comes from Exodus.
So that's now drawing us back to our parasha, right? That's the first real reference here to what we're meant to be talking about, which is Bishalach, Exodus 14:15. There it says, in describing the Israelites at the edge of the seashore, that the angel of Elohim moved from behind to in front. And that's part of what initiates this process that begins the splitting of the sea. Notably, they're drawing our attention to the word Elohim there, right? As David correctly put in a poof instead, Elohim, right, which is a plural. And here, which is a kind of stand-in for the feminine personification of the divine rather than the masculine. The Zohar tends to assume, rightly or wrongly, that when we use the tetragrammaton, Yud, K, Vav, K, we're talking about the male. And when we use the word Elohim, we're talking about the female. So they're going to often interpret things on that basis. This verse from Song of Songs, which itself is read entirely as a love story between he and her, between the male and the female aspects of God, has a wonderful proof text for this idea. Because it says there's 60 warriors surrounding her, the warriors of Israel. And they point out that means Israel above, right? That we're talking about a heavenly idea of Israel. Notably, the Matronita, aka the Shekhinah, is often also called Knesset Yisrael, the Assembly of Israel. So the collective idea of the people of Israel is one and the same with Shabbat, is one and the same with the Torah, is one and the same with Matronita, is one and the same with Shekhinah, is one and the same with all these other concepts of femininity and divinity, which itself is a weird way to think. But the Zohar, like all mystical texts, thinks in correspondence, and they draw connections between stuff that we necessarily wouldn't as a result. And so she has her own personal armies, right? 60 warriors surrounding her, her elite Praetorian Guard, we might imagine. And that is what is being referred to, they suggest, in the story of the Exodus in Beshalach, when it said the angel of Elohim moved. It's that they all move around her and behind her, surrounding her. Okay? Now, the question that begins the next paragraph might stand out as a result of what was said in the previous one, but let's take a look at it anyway, because they're trying to really draw out. They're asking themselves questions because they know this is a strange idea. If they don't bother to ask the question, it's even stranger. But here they're trying to teach us. So they start by asking a question almost every paragraph and then trying to answer it. David, do you want to do one more?
Now, is she called Malach Elohim, the angel of Elohim? Rabbi Abba said, yes, come and see. Rabbi Shimon said as follows. The Blessed Holy One established before him a holy palace, a supernal palace, a holy city, a supernal city called Jerusalem, the holy city. Whoever enters the presence of the king enters only through this holy city, following the way to the king. For from here the way is paved. As it is written, this is the gate to Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the righteous shall enter through it.
Okay. Right, a familiar line to us from singing in Hallel. We sing loud and proud very frequently throughout the year. Zeh hasha'ar l'Adonai. So we're going to see what are they suggesting here about this idea of a holy palace, a supernal palace, a holy city, a supernal city. By the way, supernal is the translation that Daniel Matt is using for an Aramaic word that's usually ila'a, which means upper or higher. So what they're really trying to create is some idea of symmetry here, yes? What's the symmetry, and what does Jerusalem have to do with it?
So it's like correspondent, from the top to the above. So it's like reflection.
Very good. Right? We saw this hinted at a little bit before, and we mentioned this is a common mystical idea, often phrased as above, so below, right? That things on the earth or in the cosmic realm mirror that which is supernal or celestial, or what, that things that we experience have a symmetrical, reflected, and corresponding experience in some other world, in some cosmic realm. And that allows us to see symbols in our world as referencing things that happen in other worlds and vice versa. So there's a dual sense of the world being both this one and that one, earth and heaven. And Jerusalem, Hebrew grammar nerds, what's funny about Jerusalem? Yerushalayim.
That it's a plural.
It's not exactly a plural. It's very close. It's a
dual?
dual. It's a dual form, yes. So Hebrew and Arabic and other Semitic languages don't just have a singular form and a plural form, but many nouns have a dual form, which refers to two of them, a pair, which although sometimes is considered unlucky, here is evidently a good thing, because Yerushalayim, although it's not meant to be, sounds like it's a dual form, meaning that there's two Jerusalems. There's Jerusalem, as the rabbis say, shel mata, the Jerusalem of below, and Yerushalayim shel mala, the Jerusalem of above, which is a very, very, very old idea that has nothing to do with the Zohar. But they are borrowing here in order to suggest to us this shouldn't be foreign. The idea that there is something below that mirrors something above, Jerusalem below, Jerusalem above, palace below, palace above. And every palace needs a king's road to find, so that people can find their way there. And the road, the gate, right? Gate being a naturally feminine image because it is something through which people pass, right? There's lots of genital related imagery connected to the image of gates. The gate to God is Matronita, right? So we're starting to define the relationship here a little bit more, right? So David's question earlier, what is she our version of God? In essence, yes, right? As they're going to establish, if we want to approach God, the part that we have to approach first is the Matronita. She is the gate to God as a whole. She is the part that we can access. She is the part that must be penetrated, if we want to use that language, which itself evokes many of the genital imagery here. And they have a proof text. They always have a proof text, however much you read it. Psalms, this is the gate to Adonai. The righteous shall enter through it. Right? So those who want to approach God do so by first approaching the queen. The queen first, then the king. And that's very much the sense that's being described here in terms of how she acts in the world around us.
And I'll just add about Hebrew grammar. It is also interesting that the Hebrew word gate, despite being shah, without a hey or a taf on the end, is still a feminine word.
Is it?
Yes.
Interesting. So it's kind of a hidden one.
It is a very hidden one because I think it's dual. I think it can be both.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Although, yeah.
You do say sha'arim and you do say sha'ar rahav, but I've got this in the back of my head that it is also considered as female.
It's interesting as well because the word you use here for way is probably derech, which is another one where you have drachim and drachot used interchangeably.
Yes, drachim and yes. You never say drachot, but you do derech aruka.
Yeah, you can. Right, David, I see a hand. You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm on the phone. Just because I came a little bit late, are we talking about the Matronita as the Shekinah here, or it's
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So they use lots of the words interchangeably, which is partially on purpose to throw us off. But the Matronita, the gate, the way to the tree of life, the people of Israel, the Torah, Shabbat, they're all identical terms for the idea of, capital S she. Interestingly, unlike the male persona, she doesn't really have a proper name. So what they do is understand the male persona as being Yud He Vav He, that the tetragrammaton refers to the male persona, and that the divine name Elohim refers to the female persona, partially because of its inherent plurality and partially because of how it shows up in the Torah. Okay, so let's see more about how this dynamic works between this sort of domestic arrangement between king and queen. Who does what labor and why? That's obviously the key question for us in thinking about this. Someone else want to pick up? Anybody keen to read?
I can read.
Sure, David.
So every mission that the king wishes issues from the house of the Matronita, every mission from below to the king enters the house of the Matronita first, and from there to the king. Consequently, Matronita is agent of all, from above to below, and from below to above, for she is the opening to the king, way to the king, and no secret is concealed from her, from above to below, or from below to above. Thus, she's the agent of all, as it is written, Malcha, the messenger Elohim, who was going before the camp of Israel moved in Exodus 14. Israel above. Malcha, the messenger of Elohim, as it is written, and the tetragram was going before them by day, as we have established.
Okay.
Now,
just pause you there, David, right? So they're doing something the Zohar rarely does, which is to actually make sure we understand. Usually the Zohar couldn't care less if we understand, we, the reader. Actually, it doesn't want us to understand. But here it's basically repeating and summarizing the same idea in order to make it very clear. And how would we phrase that idea? What is it telling us here?
That is always the Shekinah or the Matronita, the way to get to the male part of the divinity.
Yep.
So,
right.
But in some way, the male part is concealed, but not the feminine part. Also, then actually, symmetrically, the feminine part is concealed, and we know the male part.
So, yeah. So, do you mean in reference to the common understanding of genitalia as the male being exterior and visible, and the female being concealed and interior? Right. Here we have what seems to be somewhat of an inversion, perhaps, which is interesting. Right. We talk about kind of the idea of being socially male in description of many female characters in literature sometimes, and you have a bit of that here in the way that the Matronita is described as the active force, whereas the masculine is the passive. We don't see or talk to or hear from the masculine king. Let's just use the words king and queen to make it easy, right? The king, if he wants to give issue an order, it has to go through Matronita. It comes from her. If we down here want to say something to the king, it has to go through Matronita, right? That's the only way. She is the only way to kind of transcend or trespass the divine and the mundane, the earthly and the heavenly. It's only her. She's the one way through. It's a bottleneck. Yeah, Renata, I see hand. Thank you.
So I was just going to say, I think you mentioned this before. There is something about this she aspect of God that is very attainable, that is very kind of real, very physical, and is kind of on the front of everything. And then this kind of more transcendent and less attainable element of God, so it's almost like she is there fighting and being an angel, blazing and having access to all doors and being the door, the gate. And actually the he is kind of just less. We don't hear much, which is really interesting. Is we don't know what he's doing. And that I don't know, my ignorance, but that's,
yeah, no, absolutely. If you compare it to a family, which obviously the Zohar often does, and certainly later Kabbalah really does, there's very much a kind of, Freudian sense here of kind of the mother is the one who is there and involved, and when there's something wrong, she's the one the children go to, and when something needs doing, she's the one that does it, and the father is kind of sitting in his study thinking. And, it's very old-fashioned imagery of parents, perhaps, but when they want to approach or get permission for something, they have to kind of knock nicely, and the mother escorts them over to the study, and they say, oh, can we do this? And everything is facilitated by her, right? There's no direct approach to him. The interesting thing is that works perhaps in our kind of 19th century idea of parenting, but here we're talking about royalty, which isn't always the case. The idea that the queen is kind of the intermediary with the king. Don't know of much precedent for that in a sense of kind of conceiving of royalty. I think they were both equally as distant to many people in times in which monarchy had a little bit more meaning than it does today. Robin?
Sorry, trying to get off mute. So quite the use of the word agent, just thinking about what that means sort of legally. Agency is you can act on behalf of,
that's right,
the other party, and it's sort of interesting that Matronita is agent both ways. So so it's not only that we don't hear directly from the king, it's that the king doesn't hear directly from us as well. And so that it's like, if you think of God as being everything, Matronita is the one thing that is observing everything, is really, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think we often miss the fact that she's kind of a double agent here, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, that word agency is as loaded in Hebrew and Aramaic as it is here. It's the word is a reference to shaliach, right? To be a shaliach is to be an emissary, an ambassador, an agent, and it is legally to act on someone else's behalf. There's lots of Talmudic halachic literature, but the idea that shaliach gufo, right? That if you appoint someone as your messenger, they are in all respects acting as you. They can sign paperwork, they can make decisions. You can even get married through a shaliach. You can tell someone else, I appoint you to go and engage that woman to marry me, and that person goes and does the engagement on your behalf, right? Which is a very weird idea to us today. But it made sense in a world in which people often didn't travel very far. It took a long time. So this idea that she is this agent who acts for us to the male and for the male to us is actually a very robust one. And like you said, gives her both a huge amount of power, but also a certain degree of subservience to both sides. It's a mixed, as it often is when we deal with femininity. It's not necessarily a feminist embracing of her divine power here. She is a lot of responsibility and she is critical to the whole system, but she can't really act independently either. Right, which is why they often connect the imagery of the Matronita to the moon, right? Because the moon shines on us, but it doesn't shine of its own light. It reflects the light of the sun. We don't see the sun at night. The sun has disappeared behind us over the horizon, but we see the sun's light even at night because it shines on the moon and bounces back down to us. And so there's a way in which the feminine is understood similarly, that actually she doesn't shine on her own, but when everything else seems dark and the sun appears to be missing, we still see the light from the sun through her. She is the one that channels it. Like a mirror, like a gate. There's lots of imagery here that goes deeply, deeply symbolic. The Jungians amongst us will have a field day here with all of the archetypal imagery of femininity and with passageways and all of that kind of language, and rightly so, because that's really what they're getting at in many ways. But the Zohar is not unaware that actually this might not be the ideal arrangement, or that we as the reader might go, well, that doesn't seem very fair, or more likely, well, that doesn't seem right that this, female character is doing all the work, right? There's something that they suspect we might object to because they start to answer a question that we haven't asked, which begins with the next paragraph. David, do you want to continue? You still game?
Yeah. Sorry, just need to find the game on the phone. Oh,
that's okay. We're at now. I'll highlight it in yellow.
Okay. Now, it is an honor for the king that the Matronita should go and wage wars and act as an agent. While
Sorry, that's a question that's really critical. We read that as a question. Is it an honor, right? Is it really an honor that the king should send the Matronita to go do all this? Just to emphasize, go on.
Well, this may be compared to a king who coupled with a lofty noble lady. The king saw how her glory surpassed all the noble ladies of the world. He said, "They are all concubines compared to my lady. She surpassed them all. What shall I do for her? Well, look, my entire household will be in her hands." The king issued a proclamation. Henceforth, all affairs of the king are entrusted to the Matronita. What did he do? The king placed in her control all his weapons, all warriors, all those royal jewels, and all royal treasures. He said, "From now on, anyone who needs me cannot speak with me until he notifies to the Matronita."
Okay, so they've given us what is technically called a mashal, right? A parable to try and illustrate the point. And the question they're asking, hello, Nina, is, right, we have this idea that all of the access to the divine realm happens through the divine feminine, the queen, aka Matronita. But isn't it a little bit kind of improper for the king to hand over all of his control to the queen and for her to do all the work? Shouldn't we be kind of, clutching our pearls, horrified by that? And how do they explain that this is actually not just not a bad thing, but actually a good thing? What's the image they want us to have in mind?
But it's very clearly that it's the haram, not the kings have concubines, but the primate is the first wife, that she is in charge for all the other concubines as well. It's very, very royalty, monarchy, Middle Eastern.
Yeah. I mean, not specifically Middle Eastern per se, but yeah, absolutely. There's a sense here that we're using an image that probably doesn't mean that much to us, which is the idea that the king has kind of all of these women at his disposal, but there's one that he loves above all the others. He thinks is much better than all the others. She's a noble lady, a matronita, who is supremely gifted, and he loves her so much and wants to do so much to recognize her authority that what does he do? He hands over his whole household to her. She's in charge of everything. And he tells them, the subjects, we're the subjects in this analogy, anyone who wants to talk to me has to go through the matronita. So it's an honor to her that he is bestowing upon her. So yes, she has a very powerful role, but we're reminded that it comes from the masculine. So before we get too excited about the feminist imagery, we have to remember kind of how it's framed within the patriarchy here, that she does have a big role for us, but it's only at kind of his behest that that's the case. So that's the first part of the parable, which gives us this image of a king and his preferred noble lady. And now we read the second half of the parable, which again connects back to what we read in the beginning regarding Bishalach and the idea of the matronita. Someone else want to pick up from similarly? Renata, go ahead.
Okay. Similarly, the Blessed Holy One, out of his great love for Assembly of Israel, entrusted everything to her. He said, "Look, all the others are nothing compared with her." He said, 60 queens are they and 80 concubines. One she is, my dove, my perfect one. One she is to her mother. Song of Songs 6, 8, 9. What should I do for her? Well, look, my entire household will be in her hands. He issued a proclamation. Henceforth, all affairs of the king are entrusted to Matronita. He placed in her control all his weapons, lances, swords, bows, arrows, catapults, fortresses, stones, all those warriors, as is written. Behold the bed of Solomon, 60 warriors surrounding her, all of them skilled with a sword. Song of Songs 3, 7, 8. The king said, "From now on, my battles are in your hand. My weapons are handed over to you, along with the warriors. From now on, you will guard me, as is written, Guardian of Israel, Psalms 1214. From now on, anyone who needs me cannot speak with me until he notifies Matronita. As is written, Bezot, with this shall Aaron enter the holy zone. Leviticus 16:3, agent of all, as we have established. Consequently, all is honor of Matronita.
Right, thank you, Renata. So we've drawn a huge amount of stuff together that we've seen previously. Nothing necessarily new, but some interesting nuance. By the way, just to point out, the way in which Song of Songs is used is absolutely brilliant, right? Because they're reading Song of Songs as being a kind of narrative of the divine relationship. And so they're able to pull out these proof texts that actually are pretty unusual in how they're used here, at least from where you would see them used elsewhere. And just to point out this last grammatical point here, when it says as a proof text, Leviticus 16:3, that verse, bezot, right? Zot is the feminine demonstrative particle in Hebrew, as opposed to ze, which is the masculine demonstrative particle. And so they're reading this hyper literally, bezot, with her, right? Zot being an indicative of feminine, Aaron shall enter the holy zone. So they're connecting all these pieces together about Matronita, the divine feminine, the Shekhinah, not only being the commander of heaven's armies and being responsible for interacting between humans and the divine, but also being the one who is indeed responsible for the divine realm and in whose hands all of it is placed. Right, David?
Yeah, so first of all, apologies. I made a mistake before. I've just checked it. Shah cannot be feminine.
Even more interesting then, isn't it?
I didn't, so I don't want to mislead anyone and think that they think it is. What I'm seeing, I think, interesting here is the way that Matronita has been appointed a deputy. So one gets often a few deputies. You've either got the deputy, so if you've got the leader and they appoint 3, 4, 5, 6 deputies, or 2 deputies, many deputies, a number of deputies, which would be the normal thing. So each one is in charge of one thing in order to delegate. But what we've got here is she's in charge of everything. So there's just the one deputy. So it's almost like saying, so what is the point of him? Is he unattainable? We have to go to him through her, but she is everything. She's got just as much power as he has.
From our point of view, she has more. Right? From our point of view, she has exclusive power.
Yeah, yes. So
how do we feel about that, right? Taking it out of the text itself and thinking about what that would mean in terms of the way we observe religion, we probably don't envision when we speak to God or when we think about connecting with the divine that we're doing so through this very feminine persona. What exactly feminine means in this sense, by the way, also different than we might expect. But it might change our perception of what we're doing.
Yeah, because I mean, when we pray, should we be praying to her as opposed to him?
Are we already doing that and we just don't realize? The Zohar might suggest that actually all our prayers are going through her anyway, whether or not we realize it. Right, David?
Well, I think that if you consider the divinity, the emanations of all the attributes, you don't really distinguish which part of the divinity you pray, because everything is simultaneously, so they will interact each other, and then some way, you have the relation with one of the aspect of divinity. They are simultaneously and individually, so I don't think that it will affect the relation with the divinity itself. It's just to make complex the divinity itself. The aspect of divinity is a multi Sephirot, so it's all expressions. So I don't see dichotomy in that.
Well, just it's a good point, right? That actually, and by the way, not completely true, because some people do structure their prayers. If you look at some Sidurim, certain brachot in the Amidah are to this sphira and certain are to this sphira, and other people find that to be absolute heresy. But here in this whole passage, we haven't heard about the sphirot, right? We haven't heard about any more nuance than he and she, right? King and queen. And as far as we know, our entire religious life, our entire connection to the divine is through her. She is the one which we interact with. She is the one who acts in the world. He is distant and far away, which is strange. So on purpose or inadvertently, our religious life is dependent on a feminine entity, it would seem. Robin.
It seems
Sorry, Lee. What's that? Robin, you had your hand up, a little digital hand, but I feel like I need to call on it.
Sorry. Still, I just find the language uncomfortable still, in the sense that it still feels like the female is subservient to the male, and it's very much he is deciding things, and by his grace does she have these powers.
100%, right? We do not want to mislead anyone here to think that this is a contemporary feminist endorsement of equality. It isn't, right?
No.
But it is very different than what we think of when we usually think about the divine. Whether it's possible to endorse this and extract it from that kind of hierarchy is a different question, which I think a lot of people are struggling with today. Because a lot of people start to look at this and they go, oh, look, a divine feminine. This is a feminist text. And in some sense it is, right? Because we have a real robust idea of femininity within the divine. But as you say, this is, the moon versus the sun. This is always someone who is dependent on the masculine, however distant he might be, who is only given her position of power because she is beloved by him, etc. Lee, what did you want to say? And then I want to jump to our other text real quick.
Yes, sorry, Robin, I didn't mean to cut you off there. So two small observations. One is that to me it seems like God's assessing all of the possible attributes and aspects that could be used to interface with the world, and saying this is the best one for the job. So all the parts of me that I could use to interact with the world, this is the one I want to put forward. And then the other observation was that it's interesting that they bring in the piece about Aaron, with Aaron being like an agent for Moses as well. So it's like the two agent, the agent from above and the agent from below.
Love that. Right, absolutely right. Aaron acts on Moses' behalf. The Matronita acts on the king's behalf, and they meet in the middle in the tent of meeting. Right, and neither Moses normally goes in there, nor does the masculine divinity. There's a lot of interesting ways in which you could read much of these texts through this lens in unconventional ways. Both very good observations. Right, I see Renata and David have hands up. I just want to jump back in a minute, but Renata, go ahead.
I just wanted to point this from now on. So it looks like there was a decision point, a turning point, whereby now she's in charge, and he nominates her as a deputy.
Yeah.
So I'm just a little bit curious. Why now?
Yeah. And also, when is now, right? Well, when is that? What is being described there? Obviously, this is in the context of thinking about chapter 14 and 15 of Exodus, where the battle is happening. I think that might be partially why this is here, right? So just to read this last paragraph, and then we're going to jump quickly to the other text. The angel of Elohim who was going before the camp of Israel moved. They've quoted this several times, as has been said, and went behind them, right? So the text, it's worth looking at. These verses are very important to the Kabbalah. These verses describe the angel moving from the front to behind them as they start to approach Pharaoh's armies or to stand in between them. And it says, why behind them? So that in front of her would appear warriors, catapultiers, lancemen, swordsmen revealed in front of her, since other camps were coming to wage war against Israel from above. Right, so the main text, the main thing this is trying to be explained is what's up with this whole angel of God moving in front of the Israelites or behind the Israelites? And the answer is because she's the commander of heaven's armies, she moves strategically in order to allow all of these divine armies of heaven to go and fight, right, the other camps, which it goes on to tell us are the camps of the evil angels who are been hired by Pharaoh to wreak vengeance on his behalf against the Israelites. And ultimately, the Zohar is going to endorse this idea that the whole splitting of the sea is a battle up above between the forces of heaven and the forces of darkness. Some very, as we said earlier, Tolkien-esque imagery in which you have these two armies fighting above as the Israelites and the Egyptians are struggling down below with the splitting of the sea. And again, it's that symmetry that there's a battle happening above just as there's a battle below, right? Moses and Aaron are leading down below by splitting the sea. The Matronita is leading above by fighting the evil armies of the bad angels. It gets very complicated and also very different than what we imagined. You will not see this version in the Children's Illustrated Bible, probably for the best, because I think you'd have nightmares. Now, I want to jump a little bit before we conclude and before we talk a little bit more about Matronita to a different text. And part of the reason is because it's from a different place, but it's from the same rabbi. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see that one? Right. So our text that we just read was from volume 2 of the Zohar on the book of Exodus. Now we've jumped to volume 3, which is on the book of Leviticus. And Rabbi Abba, who occurs many times throughout the Zohar, again, is giving a similar teaching, which is really interesting in order to draw a comparison. I'm just going to read this one myself because I think it's very tricky to parse out. But the key thing is, how many people here have ever sung Eshet Chayil on Friday night or heard it sung? Anybody? Yeah? Right, okay. So maybe some of you have sung it yourselves. Right, so Eshet Chayil is what it's typically known as, but it's chapter 31 of the book of Proverbs. And it's a really beautiful poem that describes kind of the ideal attributes of femininity. And often, the way in which this shows up in many people's day-to-day lives is that husbands will sing it at Friday night dinner tables before saying Kiddush to their wives, as a way of honoring all the work their wives, who usually do all the cooking and cleaning, have put into preparing for Shabbat. And in that sense, it's a very patriarchal text, and one which, by the way, many people in our egalitarian orbit find quite distasteful as a result. What many people miss about Eshet Chayil is that the language of femininity included in there is not necessarily what you'd expect. The title itself in the first verse, Eshet Chayil mi Yimsa, right? A woman of valor or of fierceness, right? A woman of strength is what's being described. And there's a really interesting way in which the Zohar is now looking at that text, which I encourage you to look at more in depth with this in mind, and seeing it as not a song to the wife of the household, or not only to the wife of the household, but to the divine feminine, the Matronita herself. So Rabbi Abba is the one who gives us this reading of it, right? He quotes from the passage, "A woman of strength is her husband's crown. A woman of strength, that's Assembly of Israel. That's another name for the Shekhinah, the Matronita. In Hebrew, Knesset Yisrael. She has many names. She is, as we learned, the mistress of many forces and camps throughout the world." Right? So we're seeing the same idea as we saw in the Exodus passage. Again, quoting, "Her husband's crown, as it is said, a crown of Tiferet, glory." This is a quote from Isaiah. Tiferet is another name for the masculine aspect, the king. And so she is a crown to Tiferet. Again, subsidiary imagery in which she is something that sits on top of him, right? She is not independently powerful on her own. A woman of strength, again, Assembly of Israel, that's the Matronita. For by uniting with the king, she generates many forces, many camps, and many righteous ones in the world. All are called sons of the Blessed Holy One and Assembly of Israel. As is written, you are sons of Adonai, your God. Right? This is something that Moses tells the Israelites. You are children of Adonai, Elohecha. Now, we talked earlier about the names, right? Adonai being a reference to the masculine and Elohim being a reference to the feminine. So here you can see the way in which the Zohar is reading this passage is quite intensely surprising, in that they see it as Adonai Elohecha, meaning you are sons of the masculine, the Blessed Holy One, the king, and the Assembly of Israel, the Matronita, the queen, right? So it is their sexual union, the uniting, which causes all of the forces and camps and righteous ones in the world. So it's a real sense in which all of these angels and potentially humans, according to Moses at least, are actually the offspring of this sexual union between male and female. Now, this is in the context of them having a little adventure, as much as Zohar is, and Rabbi Abba encourages everyone to say a word about the Assembly of Israel, right? Everyone's meant to kind of give a little nice drosh on the Matronita. He starts, right? He says, again from Eshet Chayil, a woman of strength who can find, her price is far beyond rubies. This is the first verse that's usually cited in the poem. Assembly of Israel, who is a woman of strength, right? So it's explicit here. When we sing Eshet Chayil, a woman of strength, a woman of valor, what we mean is Matronita. That is who we are singing to and who we are singing about, right? When the verse says, who can find one like this? What does it mean? It's what you will find in the days to come. It's an implication that we will encounter her in our own lives or in the future. Who can find? To wage war against her, meaning no one can possibly do so because she's so powerful and fierce. Who can find? Who will succeed in being fully within her, constantly with her, right? Lots of imagery here about immersion, a kind of womb-type imagery, the idea of going back to the feminine. It's not possible to be constantly or completely immersed back in the Shekhinah, but that is the desire implied here, okay? Her value, or here literally her selling, is far beyond rubies. The word michra implies her price. We don't usually translate it that way when we sing it to the wife of the household, right? Her price is beyond rubies, because hopefully we're not planning on selling our wives as we're singing the song. But they don't have a problem looking at it that way when they say her price is far beyond rubies, right? They say actually the verse should read, meaning they've got the wrong word, mikcha, different word. Her purchase, right? Meaning the price we paid for her, which isn't much better, by the way. I don't know if they think they're improving that. However, all those who do not cleave to her, who do not hold on to her, remember, eitz haim hi lemachazikim ba, those who hang on to her. So all those who don't hang on to her completely and are not wholehearted with her, machara, she sells them. They're spinning the grammar on its head. She sells them, delivering them into the hands of other nations. As it is said, the children of Israel abandoned Adonai, and he sold them into the hands of Sisera. Right? So there's a very stern aspect of this Matronita, that if we don't cling to her, then she will sell us into slavery, it seems. Right? Then they are far from those supernal holy rubies, in which they will have no share, as it is written, michra, what is sold by her is far from rubies. Okay, so that's the first one. Second one, they quote again, the heart of her husband trusts in her, and no booty will he lack. It doesn't mean booty that way, just so you know. There's an awful translation, right? It means booty in the sense of treasure and value, right? That actually, because her husband trusts in her, as a result, he will be fruitful in his economic endeavors, right? The rest of this verse, by the way, implies that he hands over his dealings in the fields and his economic endeavors to her, to his wife, right? So the heart of her husband trusts in her, the Blessed Holy One, who therefore appointed her over the world to be conducted by her. We cannot get stronger language than this. The world is conducted by her. All his weapons he entrusted in her hands, all the warriors, so no booty will he lack, right? He has given over everything to her. The world is conducted by her. So it's not just Rabbi Abba who thinks this. Rabbi Chia thinks so too. Rabbi Yossi has a different verse. They're all pulling out different verses. She repays him good and not evil all the days of her life. She repays him good because she provides goodness for the world. She provides goodness for the palace of the king and its members, and not evil, for it's written in the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Right? She's only good. She's the tree of life. There's no evil in her. So they go on and on and on and on and on, right? The main thing is we have here a clear and concise statement that ultimately this is not just the view of Rabbi Abba, right? Here in a different part of the Zohar, he says, that's fine. Thanks for sharing, everyone. All those verses were spoken for the assembly of Israel, for Shekhinah, for Matronita. Meaning, not only that these guys here were giving this praise of Matronita when they were talking, but also that Eshet Chayil, the predominant Jewish statement of femininity and of the good attributes of a wonderful and rare woman, according to the text, is actually not about your average household domestic wife, but about the conductor of the universe, the one who is responsible for everything and whom we have to entrust ourselves if we want to attach ourselves to the spiritual realm. That's a pretty different read of that verse, and hopefully of much of how we think about divinity in general. And hopefully you can see through both of these, this is not just a one-off text. This is a cohesive and across the Zohar, rather consistent idea of how the world is conducted and who's in charge. Any questions, thoughts, comments about that? It's rather a strange one, I think, and ultimately, I think a very exciting one, by the way, despite the complications of what it might shape for our own perceptions of the world. David, you've got your hand up. You've been very patient. Sorry, I've been nattering on. You're on mute. There you go.
It's okay. I'm just thinking that then the observation about when I say emanation, but then here now, it reminds me that divinity is not different from any fertility cults. You know, the sacred union on the female and the male god, the couple. So
yep.
It's not that then different. So it would say very pagan then as well.
Very, 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 very pagan, right? It'd be foolish for me to sit here and say, oh, no, it's actually just completely monotheistic. And if it seems pagan, you're misunderstanding it. No, it's pretty pagan, right? Because, you know, the religions which Judaism attempted to suppress and replace were ones that had a male deity and his female consort, and the fertility of the land was based on their sexual relationship with each other, and the conception of their union formed the way in which people understood their lives on a day-to-day basis. And indeed, the entire conception of the world was based on the creative potential of sexuality, right? Often called in a scholarly sense, hieros gamos, which, you know, references this idea of kind of divine sexual unity. It's present in almost every pagan religion in some way or another, a god and a goddess. And in some ways, it's present even in non-pagan religions. Indeed, it seems, at least in ours. But you can also see why many people have been very opposed to the Zohar. Because if you're not willing to go with this, it goes full tilt, right? If you're not willing to say, yeah, that's a conception of God I'm okay with, then it's not like you can just brush this off as being slightly different than the normal understanding of God. This is radically different than the normal understanding of God. And indeed is only a narrow, very, very, very subtle distinction from the idea of worshiping a god and goddess. In a sense, we are, except they're one thing, right? We stress over and over, they're one thing. They're not two separate things, they're one thing. But for all practical purposes, we treat them as two things. At least they do here. Lorraine?
Yeah, isn't it partly the symbolism of the tree of life as well, of the Sephirot? Isn't when they talk about Tiferet and then the crown, and they're talking about the Sephirot there as well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the Sefirot are just a visual depiction of the ideas that they're exploring here. And you know, the Tiferet, which is the center masculine Sefirah, and the six that surround it, meaning six in total, sorry, the five that surround it, so the six of them are often understood to be the masculine persona, let's call it the king, and the one below, on the very bottom, that is closest to the world and to materiality by herself and dependent on all the others and acting as a gate, is understood to be Matronita, Shekhinah, Nukva, lots of, again, words for the same thing. But yes, absolutely, right? This is about that relationship between Tiferet and Malchut, right? The king and the queen. It's hard to avoid.
This also can be the bottom, can't it? In Tree of Life, you can have one tree above another tree. So maybe also the crown is, you know, it's the lowest chakra.
It's the lowest and the highest simultaneously. Yes, there's a lovely statement in Sefer Yetzirah, which is quoted often in this context, of the end is in the beginning and the beginning is in the end. Right, so you actually have a sense of, to address Robin's point, how do we kind of reclaim this if we want to be feminists who like the divine feminine? In some sense, there is some ground to look at, although Malchut is the lowest and the kind of the most subservient, there's also a ground to see the Sefirot not as a kind of two-dimensional chain, but as actually something which wraps around and touches in on itself, meaning that which is lowest is also that which is highest, which, by the way, we kind of get a hint of in these texts, right? Because she conducts everything. She's both powerless and the most powerful, and the masculine is kind of neither, is somewhere in between. So there's lots to play with there. It's not necessarily a closed book in terms of our understanding of gender in our own lives, and there's certainly much that we can do to expand it and engage with it, but it's not straightforwardly neither completely patriarchal nor completely feminist.
Just one sort of legalistic thought is that if you, in law, if you appoint someone as your agent, you still retain legal liability for their actions.
Interesting application. We think about all of this battling going on and all of the stuff that happens. There's of course a moment the Zohar is going to envision much later. The way in which the rabbis of the Zohar understand the expulsion from the land of Israel is basically divorce, right? That the king kicked out the queen and her misbehaving son, that's us, because they couldn't actually follow the rules. And so she and the prince are both exiled from the palace in a act of divine anger. And so there is a sense in which she is held responsible for our actions just because she is the agent of what comes from below. And we'll see that elsewhere, that there's actually quite a robust mythology going on behind this. And it is a mythology, right? It is less theology, meaning it is not a dogmatic statement about what God is, and more mythology, in which it has a series of narratives that overlap and ultimately tell us a rather poetic notion of what God is, which is often radically different from what we may have learned in Cheder. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We're just about out of time, but a lot of ideas packed in there in a short period of time. I'm going to share, if you're ever interested to learn more about these things and want some supplementary readings, do let me know. In our WhatsApp group, I will share one particular short passage from an excellent academic book that I think does a good job of introducing the idea of Matronita in clear language, which also might help in reviewing some of these most unusual, but I think very exciting ideas.